America Looks Abroad, presented on Sunday afternoons by the officers and staff members of the Foreign Policy Association. This nonpartisan organization, open to all who are interested in American foreign policy, offers accurate information on current world events. War is creating new problems for the Americas. The steps being taken to solve these problems will be discussed today by Mr. Howard J. Trueblood, Research Associate of the Foreign Policy Association. Mr. Trueblood.
Good afternoon. 2 months ago, a naval battle off the coast of Uruguay brought the European war home, in a very literal sense, to the Western Hemisphere. The suicide of the Graf Spee took place at a point farther away from New York than Paris or even Helsinki. Yet it could hardly have aroused more concern in this country had it taken place in Long Island Sound or Chesapeake Bay. There is no paradox in this. The Americas are organized for peace, and any threat to this peace is of equal concern to all 21 republics. Today, while Europe is fighting its wars with arm and propaganda, the Americas are fighting to keep the wars of the old world away from the new. This is more than an effort to avoid military entanglement. 21 nations are working together to minimize the effects of an economic and social catastrophe not of their own making. The Graf Spee incident offered more dramatic proof than any amount of trade statistics that this hemisphere is not shielded from world affairs. At the risk of appearing bloodthirsty, may I point out that Latin America may benefit directly from the invasion of Finland. The so-called Finnish aid bill, passed last week by the Senate, increases the lending power of the Export-Import Bank by $100 million. The purpose of this bill is, of course, to give aid to Finland and perhaps to China. The Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, may also ask for loans. Yet, even so, there would be funds left to add to the credits of about $40 million already extended to Latin America. The outbreak of the European war last August found the American republics better organized to handle an emergency than ever before. The word organized deserves an explanation. There is, of course, no American League of Nations, no customs union, no federation of any kind. The 21 nations which are members of the Union of American Republics have no common language, race, or culture. Their economic structures differ widely. What they do have in common is the successful overthrow of European domination, a desire for peace, and a growing sense of economic interdependence. Their organization consists of a self-imposed commitment to work together to preserve peace and a willingness to tackle mutual economic problems in a cooperative way. The war has emphasized the need for Pan-American cooperation in an economic as well as a political sense. To some extent, hostilities have thrown this continent on its own resources. Should efforts to keep out of the war fail, close cooperation between the United States and Latin America would become even more important. Meanwhile, the war is already having a profound effect on inter-American relations. It has tended to eliminate some old problems, such as the German trade and political drive in Latin America, but it has created other problems. While creating new problems, however, it has strengthened the will and machinery to solve them. The most apparent economic effect of the war is the disruption of normal trade. Latin America, we must remember, is a producer of raw materials and foodstuffs. Its international trade depends upon world demand and prices for a relatively few commodities. 5 products, petroleum, coffee, frozen and chilled meats, sugar, and copper, make up over half of total exports. Some of these products, as well as others I did not mention, are just as important to nations at war as to nations at peace. Yet a large German market has been lost owing to the blockade. Part of this loss may be offset by increased sales to Great Britain and France, but this does not apply to all commodities, nor does it apply to all Latin American countries. The greatest hope for Latin American prosperity lies in larger sales to the United States. The war has already caused a heavy increase in trade between the United States and Latin America. From September through November, there was a steady rise in both exports and imports. So far as exports are concerned, it is no coincidence that November sales to Brazil, Chile, and Peru were about double the figure for 1938. These are the countries where German competition had been most severe. The removal of German competition, however, was not solely responsible for increased American exports. Great Britain and France also found difficulty in maintaining export markets while straining their economic structures to produce war materials. Trade between the United States and Latin America undoubtedly will rise further as the war continues. Even if no direct steps are taken to expand this trade, Latin America must turn to this country for many products formerly bought from the belligerents. Our chemicals, machinery, and railway equipment will replace those of German origin. At the same time, the United States will find, as we found during the last war, that Latin America can supply products usually bought elsewhere. Economic recovery in this country, whether or not brought about by the war, would also bring a large increase in the United States demand for Latin American industrial raw materials. Yet it is evident that trade between Latin America and the United States is much smaller than it could be. The full economic potentialities of the Western Hemisphere have by no means been realized. The problem is not simple. The United States has vast manufacturing capacity and a large supply of idle capital. Latin America is a reservoir of natural resources and a market for manufactured goods. The United States is at all times a good market for certain Latin American foodstuffs, such as coffee, cocoa, bananas, and sugar. We provide either no market or only a small one, however, for many of the most important products of Latin America. These products include corn, wheat, cotton, meat, and wool. The question of increasing Latin American trade between the Americas did not arise purely as a result of the war. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, in effect since 1934, has helped to stimulate commerce. Last year, over 50% of our exports to Latin America went to countries with which we had trade agreements. The ratio for imports was even higher, about 63%. There are many other factors involved, but the trade agreements seem to have benefited the United States more than Latin America. Our exports to trade agreement countries have risen more than imports. In general, the United States has been able to negotiate trade agreements with Latin American countries from which it buys non-competitive tropical products. On the other hand, we failed to reach an agreement with Argentina and Uruguay, which export commodities similar to our own. The Trade Agreements Act is only one instrument for inter-American economic cooperation. At present, the Inter-American Financial and Economic Advisory Committee is playing a leading part in this work. This group consists of one expert from each of the 21 American republics. It was formed by the foreign ministers of these nations who met in Panama shortly after the outbreak of war. During the last 3 months, the committee has been writing a new chapter in the history of international cooperation. The immediate task of these experts is to ease the shock of the war on the Pan-American economic structure. The committee, however, has a long-term peacetime goal. This goal is the permanent expansion of inter-American trade on a mutually profitable basis. This implies better use of the natural resources as well as the industrial and financial capacity of all the American nations. Of more fundamental importance, it means raising the standard of living. It implies a greater degree of Western Hemisphere self-sufficiency. The Inter-American Financial and Economic Advisory Committee has already demonstrated that it is an effective machine. It has drawn up plans for an Inter-American Bank which will have a capital of $100 million contributed jointly by the American republics. In a sense, it will be an American bank for international settlements. Such an institution can help to overcome exchange difficulties which now plague the greater part of Latin America. It can serve as a direct stimulant to trade. It can provide much-needed capital to Latin American republics without any suggestion of imperialistic motives. If the plans submitted to the 21 governments are approved, the bank may well become the most effective instrument of economic cooperation yet established. We usually think of millions of dollars when talking of inter-American cooperation. Perhaps that is why little has been heard of an appropriation of $155,000 recently approved by the House of Representatives and now before the Senate. This sum is to carry out the program, or part of the program, of the Interdepartmental Committee on Cooperation with the American Republics. This committee represents 16 federal agencies, and its work is far more important than the size of its appropriation would indicate. One of the items approved by the House will give the Department of Agriculture more money to study the development of new products in Latin America. More specifically, the Department of Agriculture wants to encourage Latin American production of rubber, quinine, hemp, and similar commodities not produced in the United States. The department has already established a tropical forest experimental station in Puerto Rico. If the Senate approves, the Public Health Service will receive funds to increase cooperation with the Pan American Sanitary Bureau. The United States Travel Bureau will receive money to prepare a long-needed guidebook on this country. The State Department will receive financial aid for translating many government publications into Spanish and Portuguese. The Interdepartmental Committee's program is by no means limited to these projects requiring additional money. This is notably true of the loan of civilian experts to Latin American governments in accordance with legislation enacted in 1938. Thus far, 9 countries have taken advantage of this service. Advice and technical help have been given on matters ranging from road building to taxation and monetary problems. Inter-American cooperation in the realm of political matters is no less important. Here, too, there are many problems. One is the lack of a common denominator in internal politics. The war may stop the threat of German penetration, but a large number of dictatorships remains to dilute Western Hemisphere democracy. Yet these dictatorships do not imply a division of sympathies in the present European wars. On the contrary, there is almost a complete united front, in a moral sense, against the totalitarian states. This is in sharp contrast with the division of sentiment during the Spanish Civil War. Political problems are not confined to those of an ideological nature. The republics of America promptly declared their neutrality in the European War. In the Declaration of Panama, they established a wide safety belt designed to keep war far from the shores of the Western Hemisphere. They declared that it was their right to have American waters free from hostile acts. As defined by the Declaration, American waters extend to an average distance of 300 miles offshore. Great Britain, France, and Germany have refused to recognize such a safety zone. It is the task of the Inter-American Neutrality Committee to devise a formula which will maintain the spirit of the Declaration and at the same time avoid complications with the belligerents. The problems of inter-American relations cannot be dismissed. At the same time, we must remember that the Pan-American movement has overcome many obstacles to reach its present plane. The machinery for inter-American cooperation is more elaborate than ever before. The present strength of Pan-Americanism, however, does not lie in the number of ways in which it is being promoted. It lies rather in the new effectiveness with which instruments for political and economic cooperation are being used. Goodwill between the United States and Latin America is not sufficient in the present stage of world events. This goal has been achieved. The present aim of Pan-Americanism is the attainment of a higher degree of political and economic security for the Western Hemisphere. The war has broadened the scope of action and increased the problems. Fortunately, war has both hastened the building of new machinery for Pan-American cooperation and revitalized the old.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Howard J. Trueblood, Research Associate of the Foreign Policy Association, was today's speaker in the 16th broadcast of the series, America Looks Abroad. If you are interested in knowing the facts behind the headlines, send for a free copy of the weekly bulletin written by the people you hear on this program. Just address your letter or postcard to the Foreign Policy Association, number 8 West 40th Street, New York City. If you want to write that address down again, it is the Foreign Policy Association, number 8 West 40th Street, New York City. Now, because of a special feature next Sunday, America Looks Abroad will not be heard on this station. But tune in the following Sunday, March the 3rd, to hear over most of these stations another timely discussion in this series. This is the National Broadcasting Company, RCA Building, Radio City, New York.